Over here, just to kind of give you a reference, with the Mediterranean Sea over here, this is the West Bank. There's actually, in our maps, we typically do the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. You've got Jerusalem, you've got Masada down here. But I wanted to give you another reference point. Sometimes you'll see on maps, if you got the student manual, the map book that we referenced at the beginning of the class, if you were able to get one off Amazon, you will see on all the maps of this northern region and going into the Golan Heights and going up into Syria and Lebanon, you'll see there's another lake, the Hula lamp. Has nothing to do with Hawaii, but it is also a lake that has the Jordan River coming into it. The Jordan River passes through it, down into the Sea of Galilee, down into the Dead Sea. Before we move on to talking about this particular area of the Sea of Galilee, there was an article that came out last month in Biblical Archaeology Review. There is a little, Masada was the big fortress for Herod. And it's probably referenced in some of the Psalms of David as the high place, and it was a well-known place. And Herod turned it into a fortress that, knowing that he was not very popular, he was at being an Idumean or an Edomite. He wasn't full Jewish blood. That there could possibly be a revolt. There was always unrest in the land. Rome, if there was not rest in the land, would they had made him king, they would take the kingship from him. If the armies came and he had to escape, he had a fortress that was just about impregnable down here at Masada. Just south of Bethlehem is a place called the Herodian. And we were actually going into Jerusalem and nothing was being said about it. So Jordan and Wayne and I were kind of in the back. We were in the back of the bus, cutting up. And, there was, as we were... I'm just teasing, don't take that personally. As we were going into Jerusalem, we see a mountain that looks like this. And I said, that's the Herodium. And so if the armies came on too quickly, or if there was a coup in the city and there was no way that Herod was going to be able to get down to Masada, he could go to the Herodium. And actually it was... it kind of looks like this, and this is a wall, and there's a platform beneath the wall, and there's a path that goes around it and doors and things like that. But it is a very, very safe place as well. I mean, it goes nearly straight up. And what was found there in the 1960s was a bunch of stuff going back to the time of Pontius Pilate and that era, the first century AD. Although something was found, it doesn't mean that anybody looked at it. And, some 50 years later, they're looking at this ring and they begin to dust it off and get the mud off of it. And it's a very thin ring. And there is the name Pilatos on it. And what it was some kind of it was not the king's ring. It was made out of cheap metals, but it was a ring that was given to a trusted servant that if he needed to make the impression with Pilate's name in it to show that it was official, that was the ring that he used. And so now there are two in Israel. There have been two examples of the existence of Pontius Pilate that have been found. So we're going to now look at the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee in some of these areas that Jesus worked. Steve, would you get the lights, please? First place we're going to look at is the Mount of Beatitudes. As you know, the Mount of Beatitudes is the Beatitudes are part of the Sermon on the Mount. The area that for centuries and centuries and centuries has been thought of as the place where Jesus would have taught the multitudes is to the northwest of Capernaum. There is Capernaum here. There is a flat area here that goes all the way down to the beach. There is a mountain right here on this map that says the Sermon on the Mount that raises about 500 feet off the ground. It's still below sea level, but it's off the ground, and it's northwest of Capernaum. The sermon on the site where the Sermon on the Mount was preached, there's a Byzantine church on that site. We'll see a picture of it in just a minute. The sermon that was preached in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. It's also found in Luke chapter 6, where Jesus, he's not going up on a mountain, but he's out on a flat place or a plain, and that's known as the Sermon on the Plain. And there are a lot of similarities between the two. The Beatitudes, as you know, are the preamble to the Sermon on the Mount. It talks about in the kingdom of God, it doesn't matter where you are, you can experience the blessedness of life in the kingdom of God. And so it begins with all of the blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, blessed, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the pure in heart. All the blesseds. In Luke's account, and because preachers do this even to this day, they'll preach the same material in different places but change it up a little bit. There's not as many blesseds, and there's the inclusion of woes, which you don't find in Matthew's version of the Sermon on the Mount. The woes that Matthew gives are not found until, you guys need to find seats? Lloyd, you got some places over there in the back next to you? Or we got some over here? If you guys will go behind the camera, or yeah.
You can turn the lights back on.
Yeah, if you don't mind doing that real quick. Let them find their seats. No problems. The woes that you find in Matthew are not until the last week of Jesus' life. Matthew chapter 23, when he pronounces all those woes on the Pharisees. But, in the core of the sermon, it's about love of enemies, love of those that can't ever pay you back, not just loving those that can love you back, but loving your enemies as well. Also, the highest point, as I said, even though it raises up about nearly 500 feet above the ground, it's still 190 feet below sea level. Remember, the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea are the lowest bodies of water on the planet. Dead Sea lower than the Sea of Galilee, but the Sea of Galilee is about 700 feet below sea level. Even at the Sermon on the Mount's place, at its highest point, it's 500 feet above ground. It's still nearly 200 feet below sea level. And then it's also in this area that we find the Eremos. The Eremos, now the last couple of times I've been to Israel, we've not been able to see this. The first time we went in '99, we did get a chance to see the Eremos. The Eremos is just a Greek word. The Eremos means solitary place. And there's nothing that is really identifiable about a place by calling it solitary or lonely. It just means it's out in the middle of nowhere. And if you go to Mark chapter 5, that talks about Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee, they're over in this area, they cross over to the Decapolis and to the area of Cursi. That's where the guy comes out with the legion. And, they've tried to chain him down. He runs around, he howls at night, scares the kids, lives out in the graves, and says that he lives in the lonely places. So Eremos could mean really anything that's out in the middle of nowhere where there's not a lot of habitation. But when Agaria was making her pilgrimage through this area, as well as Constantine's mother, this is the area that was considered to be the place in Mark chapter 1, after he goes to the synagogue, the one that Wayne talked about last week, and there's the teaching and the healing of the guy with the demon. He goes across the street to Peter's mother-in-law's house. Shavuot ends on that Saturday when sun goes down after dark. Everybody comes to his house. He spends the night healing and teaching and throwing out demons and these kinds of things. The next morning, while it's still early, the disciples get up. They see that he is gone, and they know that he has gone to the Eremos. And this little grotto that looks more like a bus stop than anything else is the place that, it's probably not the place, but it's in the area where Jesus would have gone to pray in Mark chapter 1. You can see an aerial view here. To drive from the entrance to Capernaum up there in the upper left-hand corner to get to the Mount of Olives, and you see the structures up there, takes you about 8. Huh. I got bumped off at the first class too. Let me get back on the Wi-Fi and see. Yeah, it looks like we've lost Wi-Fi.
Something you have access to the cloud or anything?
Well, I can't connect to the Apple TV for the projector. Yeah, no, it's working fine on the computer. It just it looks like we've lost our Wi-Fi, because that's not even my screen.
Back to where we were.
Boy, it's not wanting to work very well, is it? Which Wi-Fi did you put me on, Grant?
My friend did, exactly. Yeah, my friend did it for me.
Okay, that's where we were. Yay! The angels of tech. You see up here in the right-hand corner, that's the entrance to Capernaum. You see right there in the lower left, the Mount of Beatitudes. Again, that's a climb of about 500 feet above ground, but it's going to take you about 8 minutes to drive there, and that's basically doing a lot of switchbacks to get up there. Yes. Mount of Beatitudes. You know the story. Jesus goes up onto the mountains. When the crowds come to him, he sits down. In the ancient world of the ancient Mediterranean world, the person who was being shown respect, you would stand in their presence, and the guy that was doing the teaching, the rabbi or whoever it might be, the judge, whoever it might be, would sit down. Here's a view from that mountaintop towards the Sea of Galilee. You can see it's just really close. We're looking south from the top of the mountain towards the Sea of Galilee. We're looking to the south. That dark, the tree line there is not the beach line. You actually drop down to get to the beach at that point. But you can see that the Decapolis there in the mountains on the other side of the Sea of Galilee.
Is that natural amphitheater?
That's going to be more this area right here. And that's where the parable of the sower is thought to have been taught, and where Jesus tells in Luke 5 Peter to push out after he's been teaching and the miracle catch. This is the Church of the Beatitudes. One of the things that Wayne talked about last week was during the construction of any kind of a building in the first century during the time of Jesus, they used that really dark black, dark gray, charcoal colored basalt stone, kind of a porous lava stone, as the building material. This was built in the 300s. It's a Byzantine church. When Rome moved to Byzantium, Constantinople, all of that kind of stuff. That's where the Byzantine church comes from. All of that was in the 4th century, the early 300s, when Constantine became emperor of the world and mainly of Rome. But you can see that when they built this church in the 4th century, they were trying to use some of these stones that were used during the time of Jesus' life. Here is looking from that front porch back to the south towards the Sea of Galilee. Again, the basalt stone's not the prettiest thing in the world, but you can see this is an absolutely gorgeous area. The palm trees, you can see the bougainvillea over there in the middle left side of the picture. It's absolutely a gorgeous, gorgeous place to visit. This is the inside of the church. It's a Catholic church, so it's going to have a lot of the accoutrements of the Catholic Church on the inside of it, but it's the sanctuary itself is sort of rounded, and you can see kind of behind this altar, you can see the benches. Those benches would go around it in a circle. And this is the Eremos. This is the place where church history says this is the place where Jesus went to pray, where the disciples knew he was going to be there. And this picture right here was taken back in 1999. I've not been back to this since, because this area is really hard to get to. A lot of it's been fenced off, and sometimes it's a hassle to go through the gates. But obviously that tree is going to be a lot bigger now than it was 20 years ago. But it's really, it's not much bigger than this opening between this podium and that box over there. It's got kind of a ledge in there where you can sit, and it looks out over the Sea of Galilee. It is a very lonely, private place. It is out in the middle of nowhere. There is nothing around it for hundreds and hundreds of yards. We'll look at the place called Mensa Christi now as we make our way down the coastline. Again, we're not talking about miles and miles. We're just talking about a mile to 2 miles or so as we go down the coast. We're here at Mensa Christi. Mensa Christi is Latin for the table of Christ. And what this particular place commemorates is where Jesus fed the disciples. I think it's the third showing after the resurrection. The present church that is there now, and we'll show you a picture of it in a minute, it is not the original church. It was built back in the 4th century. It was built in 1933, but it does include some of the 4th century parts of that Byzantine church. This is the place where you remember the story in John 21. Jesus is there in northern Galilee. The disciples have gone back up into the north from Jerusalem, and they're fishing. And Jesus calls out and calls them friends. Says, have you caught anything? No, we haven't caught anything. Put your nets out on the right side. Big haul of fish. John says, look, it's the Lord. Peter jumps into the water and swims to him. And the rock that this church is built on is the rock that is thought. And again, there's nothing in the text that says it's a rock. And I don't know what they're thinking in terms of building the church on the rock, and the rock is the place where Jesus did this, except that maybe they were thinking that Jesus got up on the rock. But this church commemorates the place where Jesus fixed the breakfast for the disciples. Anybody remember the number of fish that were caught in the net? 153. Somebody said it, 153. Yeah, 153 fish. It's also the place where Jesus reinstates Peter. Peter, do you love me? You know I love you. Peter, do you love me? You know I love you. Peter, do you love me? Love me. Yes, you know I do. And he's, brokenhearted at that third time. This is the place that commemorates all of that. And again, it all happened in this area. Whether this is X marks the spot, nobody knows for sure. But this is the distance between the Mount of Beatitudes, which is up on that hill, and this is Mensa Christi. So you can see, if you're Uncle Rico, you can throw a football from there to there, right? It's really not that far. And that's actually the bus that we took. That was the bus that we were on. As you can see, it's a really nice bus. Back entrance, forward entrance. It was really a nice. The guy drove it like a Ferrari too. That was cool. But you see the sign, the entrance to this place. It's the Church of the Primacy at Tabga of St. Peter, Mensa Christi, the table of Christ. Commemorates the place where Jesus reinstates Peter as first among the apostles. This is the rock inside of the church. This rock inside of the church is where church tradition says that all of this happened, and that Jesus fixed them a picnic lunch out here on this rock. And again, one of the things about the Byzantine churches is that, suppose just for laughs, let's just say this is it. It's so covered up with concrete and bricks that you don't even get a sense of what it looks like. You can't get close to it. When they said this is it, they built a church on top of it and they poured concrete on it. And you'll see in a second, this little piece right here is part of an enormous rock that this church is built on. This is a pretty famous statue that is found on this piece of property. This is Jesus reinstating Peter, and you know the story out of John chapter 21. Jesus refers to Peter as Simon Bar what? Bar Jonah. You'll notice that that Peter is sort of facing the south, and Jesus is facing kind of to the northeast, and he has his hand. You can see the Decapolis along the Sea of Galilee over there in the upper left-hand corner. So he's saying, Jesus, Peter, Simon, Bar Jonah, feed my sheep, and he's pointing to the Decapolis where the Gentiles lived. And so the story behind the statue takes into account that, like Jonah, who was told to go preach to non-Jews, he was told to go preach to whom? Ninevites, right? He was supposed to go to the Ninevites and to preach. Here is a son of Jonah that the Lord himself is commissioning in this moment to go to the Gentiles. Peter not knowing it. Peter won't know this until Acts chapter 9 when he's down in Joppa. He has the dream that Cornelius' folks up at Caesarea Maritima send the guys down to get him and to bring him up, and Gentiles are officially being preached into the kingdom of God. And it's Peter who does it. And this statue commemorates the idea that Peter is a son of Jonah. Again, Jonah is a name like John. And so it's not referencing specifically Jonah the prophet, but it's the allusion to the Jonah who was sent to the Ninevites. Peter's going to follow in his steps and preach the kingdom of God. But here's the church with that rock that Jesus prepared the breakfast on the inside of it. Look at the size of the rock that thing is built on. Again, why they decided it is this. A lot of it has to do with its proximity to Peter's harbor, where they were doing a lot of fishing. This is an area, when we talk about the Jesus boat in a minute, there's some things about it. The fishing was done up near the shore. And in this particular area where they lived, near Capernaum, there was that cove where hot water, a spring, hot, warm water would come up. And this was a place where there was, the ability to catch fish. And one of the reasons why this is the area that church tradition says, yes, this must be where it is, because this is where all the fishermen were. And Peter, being from Capernaum and being a good fisherman, he would have been fishing in this place as well. See these stones out here on the beach? What do they look like? Hearts. They look like hearts. And the theory for a long time was, because nobody has a clue what they are, nobody had a clue how they got there, because they are stinking heavy. And they thought, well, they're hearts. They're, somebody put some hearts there to commemorate the fact that Peter was saying, I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord, as he's being reinstated. As it turns out, has nothing to do with that story at all. Has nothing even to do with the Christ. What these are corner pedestals for columns. If you have a room and you have a column in the corner, that 90-degree angle goes there and the other part goes in there like that. And the little hole is where you would begin to stack the column on top of it. So a mystery, was solved when they finally discovered that these are the base of columns. Let's go to Tabgha. Tabgha, as you know, is a corruption of the name Heptapagon. It's the place in Mark chapter 6 where the multiplication of fish and loaves for the 5,000 take place. And again, this is church history saying this is where it took place. We've talked about how Tabgha is the corruption of that name Heptapagon, which means 7 springs. But it's a mystery because only 3 have been found. This church, the church of the multiplication of the fish and the loaves, is famous for its mosaics. If you've ever been to my house and you've gone into my living room, there is it looks like it's shaped like a fruit bowl. It's about that big around and it's about that deep. And the mosaic of the 4 loaves, and which is interesting, the mosaic itself inside of the church is interesting in the sense that in this particular story, it's how many loaves with 2 fish? It's 5 loaves and 2 fish. A couple of chapters later, when it's the 4,000, it's a few it's 7 loaves and a few fish. It's not very specific. The interesting thing too is, although it shows only 4 loaves, there are 2 fish on either side of the basket with the loaves in it. Obviously, somebody who was not familiar, like a fisherman, or somebody from the northern Galilee area, made that mosaic because the fish that are in the mosaic do not exist in the water. They do not have, there's no fish in the Sea of Galilee with the 2 dorsal fins that are found in the mosaic. Again, the mystery of the 7 springs, nobody knows what that's about, how it was named that, since only 3 of the springs have been found. But this is the inside of that church. And you can see there's an altar, with the white pedestal legs, and there's a black blob underneath it. Again, here is a church, even though it's trying to commemorate a spot in which something in the Bible happened, they've covered it up where you can't really feel any closeness to it. And again, this is not an X marks the spot, but you're closer than you've ever been before. But underneath that altar pedestal table is the rock in which Jesus multiplied. And again, there's nothing in the text that says anything about a rock. Where he multiplied the fish and fed the 5,000, and it's right in front, heading towards us. It's right in front of that rock that you find that mosaic of the loaves of fish and the loaves of bread and the fish. And you can kind of see, this is a long hall, and that's what it looks like. That is the stone, and it's blackened because of candle smoke and candles and things like that. And at one time, people touching it. Now you really can't get close to it at all, but you can see in front of it, you see the basket in the center with the 4 loaves and then the 2 fish on either side, and that's a better picture of the fish. But that fish right there does not exist. It was probably done by a Roman, but that fish does not exist in the Sea of Galilee. But that mosaic right there is in the middle of that bowl that you find on a shelf in our living room. So the next time you come over to the house, ask to see the fish. Ginosaur. The really funny thing about being in the Middle East is that there's so many different spellings for things. Like we talked about the word tel, T-E-L, means mound. Sometimes you see it with 1 L, sometimes you see it with 2 L's. Ginosaur is the same way. Sometimes you see it with 1 N, sometimes you see it with 2 N's, but it's basically, the same spelling with just some differences. A lot of that has to do with the way that people speak, not just the way that they would spell, but the way that they speak. For instance, Arab people have a hard time making the P sound. It's an aspirated sound. They have a hard time saying that. So the area that we're going to talk about next week, and Wayne's going to help us with some teaching here, is really called Panias, or Panias. But because Arab folk or some Semitic folk cannot pronounce the P's, it comes out as a B. So sometimes you see it as Banias, sometimes you see it as Banyas. But Ginosaur is one of those really famous places in the ancient world. How many of you have heard of the Jesus boat? The Jesus boat, really interesting story, was found by 2 brothers who were fishermen on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee. They're in that area of Ginosaur, which is just down the coast from Mensa Christi and Tabgha and Capernaum. There was a drought, and the water had receded. And these guys had aspirations to be archaeologists. And so they're out there walking in the beach that at one time had been covered up by the Sea of Galilee, but as the water receded, it was exposing things, parts of the beach that had never been seen before. And that's when they found this boat. Well, what they decided to do was to bring this boat out very, very carefully, because they were pretty sure it was ancient, even though they couldn't see all of it. So they built a wall around it that would protect it if the water started to come back, and they began to dig it out, and then they covered it with kind of a spray-on foam that would protect it, and it would kind of harden the shell around it. It would protect it from the atmosphere, it would protect it from the water, and it would float it out of the water as they moved it to a museum so that it could be studied. And so sure enough, the boat, they're starting to get it out when the rains start up again. And as the water is beginning to come, back, creep in, and the sea level of the Sea of Galilee begins to rise, they're able to finally get this thing out of the water, and they'll hoist it out. And during this digging time, there were a lot of rumors. One of the rumors was that this boat was filled with gold. And there were lots of boats that went down in the Sea of Galilee because of the weather. One of the most brutal sea battles in Israel's history was fought on the Sea of Galilee during the Jewish revolt against Rome in 68. And there were boats that went down. They were never found. They didn't, they couldn't go down and drag the stuff out of them. So they were just sunk into the mud until people have been able to find them in the modern age with technology like the Titanic and bring it up. Well, the rumor was this thing's got to have gold. Whenever a boat with gold that has been sunken is talked about, even if it's a rumor, the pirates, they decide that, they're interested in archaeology all of a sudden. So the thing had to be guarded because of that rumor until they were able to get it to a safe place there at the kibbutz of Ginosaur. The boat is dated between 50 BC and 50 AD. When they have studied it, the repairs on the boat indicate that it had been used for decades. There are 10 different kinds of wood that have been found in this boat, which indicates, man, it was in use for a long time, and it was a good boat, and they were trying to keep it afloat and keep it repaired with whatever kind of wood they could find and shape to fill in there. It's a kind, and it fits the model of the kind of boat that was used during the time of Jesus. That's why it's called the Jesus boat, and that's what it looks like. That's what they dug out. And as you can see, it's one of those museum displays or exhibits where they have slides going at the same time. And when we took this picture, there was a slide up that showed a mosaic of a boat during the time of Jesus, what it looked like, and it basically fits the pattern. One of the interesting things about this boat, if you ever fish out on the bay, modern boats, are kind of wide and flat on bottom, and they have a tunnel, that allows them to be able to move pretty fast through the water. This boat, 2,000 years old, has that same kind of a bottom. It does not have the tunnel, but it has a wide bottom that allowed it to be able to get close to the shore, into the shallows, some pretty shallow water, in fact, in order to catch fish. And you can see the ribbing in it. And, if you look very closely, you can see, there's a couple of different kinds of wood that are making up this boat. This is what it looked like as they were pulling it out of the water. You can see a picture again in the back. That boat was covered in that foam in order to float it and to protect it from the water and from the atmosphere until they were able to get it to a place where it was sort of hermetically sealed in a chamber where they could look at it. Now the interesting thing is Mark chapter 4, they're going across the Sea of Galilee. How many guys are in that boat? This is the one with, peace be still. How many people are in that boat probably? Probably maybe 13, right? The 12 disciples and Jesus. Notice the size of the boat as it's been enlarged with the spray-on foam, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cats trying to get that boat hoisted out of the water. Put those guys in that boat with another 6. You got the 12 disciples, and you've got one more with Jesus sleeping in the back. And then you're in, 7 to 10 foot swells. That is a scary boat. That is one that, what are they afraid of? What is it that they're afraid of that they wake Jesus up? Yeah, they're going to sink. Why? Yeah, the waves are coming over the top of it. The boat is going to fill up with water. They can't bail it out fast enough. It's weighted down with a lot of guys. They are going across, and they're not moving very fast. They're having to fight the waves, and it's going to be raining and waving on them a lot, and they still got a ways to go, and they are scared to death. That picture up there gives you an indication of just how many people were in that boat and what made it so dangerous to them and why they were scared to death. And Jesus is saying to them, but you're with me. But you're with me. Peace be still. Where is your faith? And so I believe that is the last picture. So, Steve, if you could get the lights. One of the questions that we had at the end of the last class was, in this particular slide presentation, we're talking about a lot of 2s and 3s and not 1s. Remember Wayne talked last week about, the way that the guides talk about places. 1 is X marks the spot. 2, you're probably closer than you've ever been before. 3, who knows, And these are a lot of somewhere between 2s and 3s, but they're in that area where, according to the biblical references and what we know of the ancient life, this is the area where a lot of this was happening. But it was somewhere near Capernaum. This is walking distance, and it is to this day, it is in a lonely place, and it is a place that people have gone to pray for lots and lots and lots of years. This place that we're going to look at some point, Peter's Harbor, it's a very famous harbor near Capernaum. It's a natural theater right here. They have literally had 5,000 people in that area. and you can be out in the boat with this amphitheater, or it's actually a theater-looking, topography, and speak and be heard. So the question was, how did they pick these places? How did they know? Well, you had the most powerful man in the world, his mother, going along and asking, is this the place? Is this the place? Is this where it happened? Who was going to tell her no? Who was going to tell her, I don't know? And so, even though she had done her work and she was asking in the right places, they were saying, oh yes, this is it, this is it, this is it. The same was true when Agaria went through. She was following on the tails of some of this, and so she was reinforcing it. Is that the area where the Sermon on the Mount took place? Sermon on the Mount took place in a lot of places. Sermon on the Plain. He preached that sermon in a lot of places. Does it make sense for that to be the mount near Capernaum where he would have gone and done that? Yes. Were there places where people could come out, around the coast and find a place where, they could gather in mass like that and hear him speak? Yes. Do we know if it's X marks the spot? No. But as far back as the early 4th century, when Constantine became emperor, the early 300s, these are areas that people in those parts of the world were saying, yeah, something happened here. Something happened here. One of the things, though, that I'm convinced is the spot is when you read Mark's gospel of the choosing of the disciples. He goes a ways, and he's coming through the Arbel Cliff, the Wadi of the Doves, the Wadi of Hammam, and he's coming along the coast, and he's where they fish. To this day they fish close to the shore, and he calls Peter and Andrew, and they leave their boat. They're fishing. They leave all that, and they follow him. The text says he went a little bit further. And there's James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who are mending their nets. And to this day, there's a cove right there because of a hot water spring that comes up that, this is where the fishermen are cleaning their nets. And you just get the sense that, this is the place where the very first disciples, you're standing, I mean, the Sea of Galilee, your feet is, touching the water as it comes up, and you see, here's this cove. He goes a little bit further, and now we're in this cove where here, traditionally, fishermen have mended and washed their nets at the end of a catch. And this is where, he called James and John. And you go, I think this X marks the spot. This is where the first disciples of Jesus were called as he was on his way to Capernaum. Pretty special experience. You want to say anything about any of this?
I'm good.
Okay. Well, there's a bell. Everybody's dismissed. We'll see you on Sunday.